Делать этот доклад будет Джонатан Дэвид Bobaljik. Доклад называется так: OV and VO Order in Itelmen. Пожалуйста, Дэвид.
Здравствуйте. Все видно? Слышно? Да?
Да.
Доклад будет по-английски, но вопросы потом можно по-русски, пожалуйста.
Хорошо.
Today I'm going to talk about the object-verb and verb-object orders in Itelmen. The word order has not been studied before, or at least I'm not aware of any previous studies. So I'm interested in the basic descriptive question of what conditions the alternation. And we'll look today at a small text or corpus study, texts that I collected in the 1990s. And I'll give you the end already, the conclusion that the word order is organized by information structure. Objects introducing new information, new discourse reference tend to precede the verb, whereas old information objects tend to come after the verb. There are parallels in other SOV languages. And time permitting, I will present an alternative that's in the literature and reject that alternative. I'll say that this is correct. So Itelmen, as we know here, is a Chukotko-Kamchatkan language. The time I collected the texts, there were about 80 speakers. There's now one remaining completely fluid native speaker and a group of others of varying levels of proficiency. This is one of the reasons to look at the texts instead of elicitation study. All speakers are bilingual and Russian dominant and have been, of course, since the 1950s. And so one of the issues here is the degree to which the facts that we're looking at are influenced by Russian contamination. Okay, so here's an example from Itelmen. These are consecutive sentences from a text. In the first sentence, the object, all the water, precedes the verb. In the second sentence, the same referent, this time presented as the lake, follows the verb. So you have an OV-VO alternation. Again, both of these happen frequently. A few points of clarification. In Itelmen, subject and object are both cross-referenced on the verb. There's agreement for subject and object. There is, like you see here, there is no case marking on subject and object. So looking at the form of the noun does not tell you whether it's subject or object. And arguments are freely omitted. The example in 2 lacks an overt subject, for example. These are familiar properties. Okay, so 2 hypotheses to consider. The first, the one that I will put forward, is that the OV-VO alternation is about information structure, new information, old information. Again, new precedes the verb. The subject is normally the topic, and we're interested in the information structure in the comment part of the topic comment. That is the object and the verb. The second hypothesis, which I'll come back to at the end, is that VO in languages of this sort, the VO order is used to avoid ambiguity. So that if you had an SOV language and you had no case marking, if you have only a single NP, single noun, it's not clear whether it's the subject or the object, and that VO order should disambiguate. And I'll return to that and do a statistical test. Okay, so we have 4 texts of different genres. These were collected in 1994, again by me. These are the Sidanka Tigil dialect. Together, there are about 900 clauses, of which roughly a third are transitive clauses. And I will note, this will come up a couple of times, the first text is from the oldest speaker I worked with, born in 1906. The other texts are from a younger generation. And so there may be differences. There are, in fact, differences between the first speaker and the others. You can see that as different generations and language shift. Okay, I need to make a couple of remarks about methodology. In terms of coding for information structure, I used as a proxy. One could ask very interesting things about new and old information. I'm using a very simple measure, previous mention in the discourse or not. A quick footnote, if an object was explicitly contrastive, even if it had been previously mentioned, I treated that as new, because of course, cross-linguistically, that new information and contrast is focus. That affected only 6 of the examples. So if you don't like that choice, it doesn't affect the overall statistics. And I also assumed that first and second person were always given always old information. Lastly, I assume that dialogues within a story are new discourses. So in the previous example, when the fox says, "I will drink all your water," the narrator has mentioned the water. But in the discourse between the fox and the goose, the water has not yet been mentioned. And so it was coded as new. And that are interesting questions to ask there. Some syntactic questions. There are 3 points of syntactic. It looks like it should be easy to code S, O, and V. You know what the subject is, you know what the object is, you know what the verb is. But there are 3 points of indeterminacy that come up for this that make things a little bit difficult. This involves coordination, perception verbs, and a passive construction. I will talk briefly about these and in more detail later in the talk. So the first example, if you have something, Angaka remained and sang, we could code this as an SV clause, Angaka remained, and then a V clause lacking any arguments, sang, right? He's saying language doesn't require overt arguments. And that's in fact what I did. The alternative would be to treat this as a coordination of verbs that share a subject. So they are in a sense both SV clauses. I had no way to resolve this in a text study. So for consistency, we went with the A count. This will affect overall counts if you're interested in statistics, but it doesn't affect the points today because we're not so interested in the subject. A more interesting, more challenging case, perception complements. He saw a fox coming, has 2 parses. One could ask if fox is the object of the transitive verb. It agrees, the verb agrees with fox as an object. Or whether the object of the verb grammatically is the embedded clause, fox coming. And this is a clausal complement where fox is the subject of the embedded clause. No way to tell just by looking at the example. And so what I did in this study for this and for the passive construction is I counted everything twice. I will present you a set of numbers which are the raw count that treat everything that might be an object as an object. And then I will present an adjusted count, a narrow count that excludes them. And we'll actually learn something that way. This affects more than 10% of the transitive, clauses. Okay, so here again are the raw counts, the inclusive counts. From all texts taken together, you see that the new information, an object representing new information precedes the verb almost 3 times as much as follows the verb. You get OV with new information 90 times and only 30 VOs. Whereas the OV-VO order for old information objects is roughly 50-50. I mentioned there is a generational difference. If you look at the text of the oldest speaker, the numbers are smaller, but you see a cleaner distinction in word order and information structure with the oldest speaker. Okay, and so we'll come back to that. This result, the fact that new information tends to precede the verb and old information objects tend to follow the verb, is broadly consistent with what we know from SOV languages like Turkish. Turkish is considered to be a verb final language. It's famous for having a focus position in front of the verb. But it also allows constituents post-verbal. These constituents cannot be new information and they cannot be topics. They represent old information that is backgrounded in the discourse. So that's a general property of OV languages that we know. And this contrasts with, and I'm nervous saying this here, this contrasts with what is presented for Russian. It's typically said that Russian works the opposite way. That in the basic ika-1, you have the new information at the end after the verb, that the VO order is prominent. That's important because there's a lot of influence of Russian, a lot of calquing in Itelmen, and we want to know if this is a Russian calc. Since it works the opposite of Russian, it's unlikely to be a Russian calc. It's something that's sort of more inherent to Itelmen. Again, we say that this is something we see in verb final languages like Turkish. There is evidence that Itelmen is verb final, and we see this in 3 constructions. I'll only mention one here. Maybe I'll mention the others. So in the auxiliary construction, the auxiliary comes after the main verb, and that's rigid. That ordering is rigid. 2 other constructions where that happens are predicate complements to the verb become. Become always follows its complement. And the same is true for what you might call complex predicates, which is one way of incorporating Russian loanwords. You use the infinitive from Russian and then auxiliary, and the auxiliary always follows its complement. We don't need to work through these examples in detail, which is good. We don't have time. The key point is that Itelmen behaves independently like an OV language, and that's consistent with what we see in the information structure. Yeah? New information, objects representing new information tend to be pre-verbal, 3-to-1, whereas if an object is post-verbal, this is going to represent old information. Okay, so it's 3-to-1, but what about the examples of apparent new information in post-verbal position? Why do these come up? I think we can actually understand most, if not all, of these examples. So let's come back and look at the perception verbs. The perception verbs examples like he saw a fox coming, this introduced a new referent into the discourse. The fox has not been previously mentioned. So this is a post-verbal new information object if it is the object of the matrix verb. But if it is the subject of the embedded verb, then it's behaving entirely normal as far as the language works. Namely, all clausal complements are post-verbal, and it turns out that all perception verb complements, all perception verb constructions are post-verbal in this way, regardless of whether the object is old or new information in the discourse. So if we treat the perception verb construction as a clausal complement construction, rather than as a direct object construction, we account for 15 out of the 28 apparent examples of post-verbal new information, and 3 of the 4 examples in the first text. So we get down to saying there is in fact only one. And I think that that involves narrative inversion at the beginning of the text. And I can talk about that afterwards if we want. Main point, by understanding more about this indeterminate nature of the perception verbs, we see actually an even cleaner distinction than the initial numbers represent. The second construction that we said was indeterminate was the passive construction, the N construction. This construction, and I'll present very briefly, has an oblique subject, but the object remains an object. If the subject is expressed, it's expressed as locative or instrumental. I've argued elsewhere, and so have others, Fortescue and others, this provides the source of the ergative or inverse construction in Chukotkin. If one assumes that these are in fact genetically related, Itelmen is actually the more conservative member of the Chukotko-Kamchatkin family. In any event, what's important here is that this construction is a very common means of making the object the topic. Here are 2 examples. I was left behind. I was raised by Sinangyot in the winter. Both of these answer the question, what happened to you, little goose? This is the little goose talking. So recall that we had said earlier that subjects are topics, and the interest that we have is in the object, which can be either in the comment, new information, or background. In this passive construction, the object, the underlying object is in fact the topic. The subject is out of the picture. The subject is taken out of the picture. So these are not transitive in the sense that is relevant for understanding information structure in the comment as opposed to the topic. So we take these out as well, and we get an even cleaner picture. In fact, for the first text, we get a remarkably symmetrical picture. Numbers are admittedly small, but we get a remarkably symmetrical picture such that new information objects precede the verb and old information objects follow the verb. When we aggregate the texts together, we see this is still strong. 85 out of nearly 100 new information objects precede the verb. And for old information objects, we get still a bit of a split, but a tendency moving towards the VO organization. Yeah. Okay. So what I want to do in the remaining 4 minutes is tell you quickly about an alternative that's out there that's prevalent in the psychology of language literature at the moment. So Gibson et al. proposed that the difference between OV order and VO order in languages that allow both and lack case marking is about communicative efficiency and information theory, not about grammar. So their proposal is that if you have a transitive verb and one NP is missing, there's only one NP, if the language has an SOV base and you hear boy saw, you don't know whether the boy saw something or someone saw the boy. It's ambiguous. But if the base is SVO, then if you hear boy saw or saw a boy, you know immediately what the grammatical function is of boy, subject or object. So they claim that in otherwise SOV languages, VO order provides redundant coding of subject-object when there is no additional coding of this in terms of, say, case. I will point out the studies that they did don't actually address any language data. They do this with gesture data, but they make claims about language based on this. So Itelmen provides a perfect test case. It has no case marking of S and O. It allows both OV and VO orders, and there's usually only one overt NP. More than half of the transitive clauses have only one overt nominal, if at all. And of course, having two is roughly a quarter of the clauses. It's fairly rare. So we have a test case for this. I won't go through all the details. I ran a binary logistic regression model. I went back and recoded all of the texts, all of the objects for their animacy, either they're animate or inanimate. And what we find is that holding other predictor variables constant. So what you find is that an object that is the odds of an post-verbal VO order, post-verbal object being animate are 2 to 1 compared to inanimate. It's more likely that a post-verbal object is going to be animate than it is inanimate. But if you compare that to the odds for being old information versus new information, the odds are almost 8 to 1. So if you like to gamble, if you're going to bet on the nature of a post-verbal object in Itelmen, you're 4 times as good to get it right if you know what the information structure is than if you know what the animacy is. So it turns out that information structure is a better predictor here than animacy is of word order. And for those who want really more statistical detail, in fact, because new information is always the object, the idea about disambiguation only matters when you're talking about old information objects, backgrounded objects. So in fact, technically what they should predict is not an effect of animacy, but rather an interaction between information structure and animacy. And so I ran another model for that, and only information structure in that model shows up as a significant factor. There is no interaction. And I can make the numbers available if we need. Okay, so the main driver of OV-VO order is information structure, not animacy. There is a small effect of animacy. I think I know what might be going on, but I won't tell you right now. What I'll tell you instead is the conclusions, that we conclude that that Itelmen is basically an OV language. We see this with verbs like become. We see this with auxiliaries. The information structure is what regulates the difference between OV and VO order in Itelmen, just as it does in other OV languages like Turkic languages. You get new information objects are almost always pre-verbal. Old information objects may but need not occur after the verb. And there's a connection to the final over final constraint, which was mentioned 2 talks ago. I can draw that out for you in the questions. Finally, the numbers, we make the claim that these are exact numbers. Hiding behind these numbers are a number of analytical choices. Among those are how we analyze perception complements in Itelmen and the passive. And we discover that these which started out as ambiguous constructions, if we analyze the perception verbs as clausal complements rather than nominal complements, the numbers become even cleaner than they were when we started. So I'll leave with a question to you. I know of no work on this in other languages of the area, and I'm very interested to hear whether other languages, in particular the other Chukotko-Kamchatkan languages, but other languages of the area show similar phenomena. So, спасибо за внимание.
Спасибо, Джонатан. Пожалуйста, вопрос.
Здравствуйте, спасибо большое за доклад. Тут это даже не только вопрос, сколько комментарий. Вот, очень похоже на то, что Дан описывал в конце своей диссертации. Вот такое краткое замечание про порядок слов в чукотском. И недавно, кажется, появилась работа, уже учитывая и Language Laws, которая смотрит на ивенские данные и порядок слов. И он тоже оказывается не таким только OV, как обычно принято говорить. А у меня вопрос, а вот ваши тексты, они с аудио или все они вот записаны со слов? Просто у меня был вопрос, есть ли какие-то наблюдения, может быть, у более молодых носителей, какие еще средства поддержания информационной структуры они используют, может быть, кроме порядка слов?
Thank you. Если могу, я отвечу по-английски, потому что мне легче. It must work because you understood the talk, so I can answer in English. Thank you for the Dunn reference. The texts are all have audio, and there's actually a very interesting point here. So as I said, I recorded the texts with the speakers, and then the speakers helped me translate and transcribe them. In that process, they sometimes made corrections. You know, they say krasny, and then they say, oh, please correct that to achalach, make it the Itelmen word. They make various corrections and additions, and in a very small number of cases, they made changes in the word order in the transcribing and editing process. Obviously, some of these were OVVO changes, and these matter to this text. So the texts that I have here, the counts that I have here, the numbers are from the edited texts. I had to make a decision, and I went with the edited texts in all cases. One could also go back and look at the actual audio recordings and look at these things, look at the numbers, and that would be instructive. Obviously, as you say, in the audio, we would also have the key missing component, the question of intonation. Are there intonational cues for this new and old information? I would like to do that. I would like to find somebody who could help me do that. That's a little bit above my pay grade in terms of doing that. But yes, this is, I'm sure there are additional cues to new and old information in the audio, in the texts. I'm sure there are interesting things to look at in terms of the changes that people made. But that's a larger project that I just haven't yet done.
Вопрос в Zoom. Да, простите, iPhone. Вопрос. Да. iPhone, да, может задать вопрос.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, iPhone is me, Emrah. Yeah, I am talking to you right through my iPhone. I had to leave my laptop in my office. Can you hear me? Can you see or hear me? Okay. Yes. Yeah, Dr. Bobaljik, thanks a lot. I had 3 questions. I was wondering if Itelmen is also a scrambling language, because that's one of the property of OV languages. So I was wondering if you ever checked that. Does it work? If it does it work the same way as other OV languages like Turkish? This was my question, first question. Second one was, you said that transitive verbs in transitive sentences, there is only usually one MP. I was wondering if this is a prodrop, something like prodrop, or if something else is going on. And the third one, forgive my ignorance, what language family does Itelmen belong to? Thank you.
So Itelmen is Chukotko-Kamchatkan. This is slightly debated, but I believe this is more and more established. It's related to Crypto-Koryak, etc. Yes, if you want your second question, yes, you could call this prodrop. This is the, I mean, here's a table. What you see is that in all but 55 sentences that are transitive, you only get one NP. We could call that prodrop.
Yeah.
Your first question was about scrambling. And the answer is no. Actually, it doesn't matter.
I would say that, okay, yeah.
So a big difference, so there is a difference between Turkish and Itelmen. Turkish allows old information to move to the left or to the right, the preverbal position. But another way in which Itelmen differs from many other SOV languages, it has no case marking. So given that there's no case marking, putting both NPs on the same side of the verb, the order OSV would be totally ambiguous. That'd be very hard. So that might be why. It does arise. So you can see 6 of the 300 transitive sentences do have the OSV order, of which, if I'm not mistaken, 4 are questions. So
okay. Okay. Last question: is it a WH in situ language also?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Филипп Григорьевич, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I was just wondering whether there are similar effects in the nominal domain. I don't know.
Yeah, beautiful question. I don't know. I don't know. Just as is not surprising, there are far fewer complex nominal constructions in texts than there are complex verbal constructions to look at. But yes, I don't know.
I would like to say something concerning the question you posed at the end of your talk. I've heard something similar about word order concerning the indigenous languages of Sakhalin. I don't remember exactly, but I think I've heard something similar about Nivh or Orok. It was something very similar. So it's not very good of an answer, but I would suggest you check it out maybe.
Great. Yes, this is what I'm looking for. And if anybody knows references for that, I would be very happy to see those.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Джонатан. Жаль, что вы не здесь с нами сейчас.
Да, мне очень жаль.
Давно не виделись.